Hi, my name is Tadashi Dozono, and I'm an assistant professor of history and social science education at California State University, Channel Islands. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about um, my recent article in Theory and Research in Social Education. The article is titled Eugenic Ideology and the World History Curriculum, How Eugenic Beliefs Structure Narratives of Development and Modernity. In this article, I conduct a discourse analysis of eugenic beliefs in the history social science framework for California public schools, most recently updated in 2017. And in this article, I juxtapose Daniel French's statues of the four continents from the early 1900s, alongside Hegel's writings from the early 1800s, and the California framework from the early 2000s. Towards the end of the article, I introduce this teaching tool of discursive constellations as a way to ask students to compare example texts from a larger discourse, right? Briefly about some of my context, I taught 9th and 10th grade world history in New York City for over 12 years with predominantly Black and Latinx students. And during that time as a teacher, a lot of my research stems from this observation that a lot of my students, even though I was teaching world history, many of my students of color still felt alienated from world history, right? And that was despite my attempts to create a more inclusive curriculum. I begin the article with talking a bit about these four statues of the four continents by Daniel French. And these statues are in front of the National Museum of the American Indian in Lower Manhattan in New York City. So when I was introduced to these statues early in my teaching career, I felt like I had this aha moment of, oh yeah, like these statues represent the narrative of world history that I was asked to teach. And it also helped me think about the way that even with a more inclusive curriculum, right? If you have, here we have four statues and there's, a quarter of the representation is Africa, a quarter is Europe, right? So this sort of idea of equal representation in terms of the amount of content doesn't necessarily mean that those representations are good representations, right? And so I want us to move past thinking about like the amount of content or frequency of how often places are discussed in world history. I think that that's an important aspect, but it's also about the quality. And in this article, I look at the persistence of eugenic beliefs within the curriculum, right? I have these slides up here to just kind of introduce how I might introduce these statues to students, right? Using a what do you see, what do you think kind of activity, right? And so here we have the statue of Africa kind of slumped over, almost naked, kind of asleep in this chair, right? And then we have Asia kind of upright and poised, but eyes are mostly closed, perhaps like kind of looking straight in front of her, but kind of downcast. And I encourage you to look up these statues, and you can find images online that show the different angles of the statues as well. This is Europe, kind of in a throne, eyes open, standing upright or sitting upright, and her arm is on a globe there. And then this is America, right? Kind of moving forward, kind of stepping forward into the future, kind of eyes looking into the horizon. And there's a lot of movement in this statue compared to the others. And so, I would ask students, like, what do you notice? And what narrative of world history do these statues tell, right? Is this still the narrative today, right? And so I use these statutes to address the persistence of eugenic beliefs in the world history curriculum, right? And so eugenic ideology is a set of beliefs about the inherent supremacy of white Europeans atop a racial hierarchy, wherein other races are not quite modern with lower intellectual and moral capacities. And we often talk about eugenics as something in the past, but eugenics has been used to rationalize ethnic cleansing, such as Nazi Germany, and medical experimentation and sterilization of marginalized populations in the US. But in this article, I assert that even though we talk about this as something in the past, the beliefs still persist, right? Eugenic beliefs persist in schools through narratives that blame students' cultures and family backgrounds and blame their cultural deficiencies, including ideas like the culture of poverty, the achievement gap, and students' linguistic deficits, right? That put blame on students and their families and communities and cultures, right? I also take a look at Thomas Fallis's work, who looked at Dewey's earlier writings and found in Dewey's early writings the persistence of these eugenic beliefs, right? So he found that across Dewey's early writings, that there was first, that all the societies of the world could be placed along a single linear path leading through the universal sociological stages of savagery, barbarianism, and civilization. Second, that all individuals of the world could also be placed along a single linear path leading through specific psychological stages. Third, that these sociological stages more or less corresponded with these psychological stages. And fourth, that non-white populations such as Africans, African Americans, Native Americans, and Aboriginal Australians were stuck in an earlier psychological, sociological stage of development. And the full citations of these readings and articles can be found within my article itself. All right, and so eugenic beliefs also overlap with ideas of modernity and colonial conceptions of development. So in Appleby, Hunt, and Jacobs' work on looking at historiography and conceptions of history over time, they found that according to modernization theory, all developing societies, whatever their differences, were bound to go through a similar set of changes. This was universal history with a vengeance, with all of its imperialistic implications for non-Western societies, right? So we see these remnants of how modernization theory continues to exist and shape world history curricular frameworks, right? And how these ideas of civilizational development is very still tied to imperialism and colonialism, right? And there are also these ties between modernity, Christianity, and eugenics. So within Hegel's work, he framed the sort of Christian age as the apex of civilization, right? So in Hegel's words, in the Christian age, the divine spirit has come into the world and taken up its abode in the individual, who is now completely free and endowed with substantial freedom, right? So that's kind of Hegel's ideal as the apex of world history's development, right? And so through this article, I found that eugenic ideology persists through these different aspects, right? Through the assumption that European ideas are the pinnacle of human reason, through the belief that Europe's democratic republics with industrialized centers represent the apex of human civilization and modernity. And this last one, drawing from Deepesh Chakrabarty's work, that nations reach political modernity according to historical developmental stages, through which, in Chakrabarty's words, it could always be said with reason that some people were less modern than others, and that the former needed a period of preparation and waiting before they could be recognized as full participants in political modernity, right? And so I'll just briefly introduce some pieces of the findings juxtaposing some of Hegel's writings alongside some patterns that I found in California's framework, right? So representations of Africa, right? This representation of Africa is sleeping, right? And in Daniel French's statue, right? In Hegel's writing, we find a similar narrative, right? Hegel wrote that Africa is a land of gold, forever pressing in upon itself, and the land of childhood, removed from the light of self-conscious history and wrapped in the dark mantle of night, right? And so what I found in California's framework, focuses on world history in 6th, 7th, and 10th grades. So those are the 3 grades that I looked at. And so in 6th grade, the curriculum framework includes Nile Valley civilizations of ancient Egypt and Kush. 7th grade has 1 unit on West Africa out of 10, focused on the gold salt trade in Ghana and Mali, and mentions the Atlantic slave trade within the last unit on global convergence. And then by the time you get to 10th grade, Africa is listed with Latin America and Asia multiple times as site of imperialism, right? So we have this decreasing importance where Africa really fades into the background of the 10th grade narrative. Asia, there's a certain respect for Asian civilization, but this idea that the sun has set on Asia, right? So in Hegel's writing, he wrote, "It is obvious to anyone with even a rudimentary knowledge of the treasures of Indian literature that this country, so rich in spiritual achievements of a truly profound quality, nevertheless has no history," right? And then in California's framework, we see this reflected in how Asia is respected as a foundation of civilization, but one that failed, right? So Asia's glory is in the middle of the narrative in 7th grade, with 3 units on Asia, on Southwestern Asia, on Islam and Persia, South Asia, on India, and East Asia, on China and Japan, right? And so again, really these kind of traditional conceptions of what counts as a major civilization, right? In 10th grade, Asia joins Africa and South America as sites acted upon by modern European states, right? And so there's very little content about Asian civilizations or societies as being major actors, right? Europe represents the sort of light of civilization, especially in Daniel French's statue. And then in Hegel's writing, he wrote, "World history travels from east to west, for Europe is the absolute end of history, just as Asia is the beginning." And so in California's framework, we find that in 6th grade, the framework maintains a distinct emphasis on Greek and Roman thought. 7th grade sets up the world for Europe to eventually dominate existing empires, still highlighting European ideas. And 10th grade focuses on modern world history, mostly on Europe and the US. And so throughout all 3 grades, European ideas help the world reach modernity, right? And the Americas, Daniel French's image of the Americas is stepping forward toward modernity. In Hegel's writing, he wrote, "The only inhabitants of South America and Mexico who feel the need for independence are the Creoles, who are descended from a mixture of native and Spanish or Portuguese ancestors. They alone have attained a higher degree of self-awareness and felt the urge for autonomy and independence." And so in the California curriculum in the 7th grade, we find a focus on Mayan and Aztec and Incan civilizations. But again, these are measured by European ideals of civilization. In 10th grade, the American and French revolutions served as models which inspired former slaves in Haiti, right? So the Haitian Revolution really is still framed through Enlightenment ideals and the fulfillment of Enlightenment ideals as modeled by the American and French revolutions. The Industrial Revolution unit emphasized European and American ideas as spreading around the world, right? And so what I want to finish with is just a quick glimpse at this activity of having students do analysis using what I call a discursive constellation, right? So giving students like a chart, the sort of a page with, this image of French's statue of Asia, a quote by Hegel about Asia, and evidence from a text that you would give students to have them do this sort of compare contrast analysis, right? And asking students to find evidence from the text that confirms or contradicts this discourse, right? So you might initially walk students through analyzing the image of the statue and the quote by Hegel, and then have them in groups or independently do an analysis of a third text, right? And so I would have students in small groups do these discussion prompts, right? How are these representations of Asia reproduced in the text? How does the text complicate these representations? Does the text reproduce eugenic beliefs? And what evidence can you find for or against this claim, right? So you might give students a passage from a textbook or a secondary source and have them reflect on, right, is this larger narrative in discourse, is it reproduced in a sample, a text that you give students, or does it contradict, right? And just finally, I encourage you to consider, in what ways is in your school's world history textbook, in what ways does the overarching narrative resemble Hegel's and French's portrayals of world history? And I ask you to consider, what is the difference between saying the modern world is the story of white people versus saying the modern world is the story of the Enlightenment, democracy, and freedom, right? Especially when these ideas from the Enlightenment, democracy, and freedom really get framed through a European lineage of thought, right? Yeah, I hope you also take the time to engage reading my article, and thank you.